Welcome to Shree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest today is Julie Scelfo, former New York Times staff writer, journalist, author, and justice advocate. Our host, of course, is Sri Srinivasan. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Please like, please comment, please share. Julie is the author of The Women Who Made New York, and her motto is quit saying fake news. Instead, get media savvy. Shri, of course, is the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. Please let us know where you're watching from. Mention your friends, tag your friends, let them know about the show. And without further ado, Sri Srinivasan.
Hello, everybody. Good morning from Puerto Rico, San Juan, Puerto Rico, where it's great to be here. We're lucky to be here in warm weather in the middle of winter. One of the drawbacks here is that you can't get a Sunday New York Times print edition, and that means that we have to adjust. And our friend Neil, our executive producer, is making sure that we will have a New York Times camera in his house, and we'll get to see it. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you for being here. Please tell us where you're watching from. Please tag and hit share so that your friends can watch us live or later on all of these channels, and especially big greetings to Julie's friends and family and colleagues. We're live on her channels as well. And so please tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what the news that you're interested in. And please ask Julie questions. She knows the New York Times really well, but of course also the news and news events. And what a big news week we've had and still going on. I just finished up our newsletter, Neil, just sending it out right now. And our focus, of course, was on the insurrection, the terrorism in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday.
Absolutely. We'll be covering that, Julie's book. We'll also be having Janie Scott join us. Neil Sheehan passed away this week, and he's the one that led the publication of the Pentagon Papers in the New York Times. And she's going to tell us a fascinating story about how he actually got the papers. There's certainly a lot to cover. I want to welcome some of our guests. Any guesses on the first person to comment, Shri?
I'm sure it's Jonathan Borstein from the East Village. Hi, Jonathan. He's watched 269 episodes of our global show that we do around the news and COVID-19. So thanks, Jonathan, for being here as always.
And Rahadian is watching from Long Island. I think Deborah is maybe relatively new. I don't recognize her name. So
Debbie's a good friend and someone we've collaborated with at Digimentors. Also a reminder to everyone, our company, Neil's Vice President of Events and Marketing there, we do virtual and hybrid events. So if you have something you're working on this year and need any help, please get in touch. We'd love to talk to you about that.
And Patricia Freudenberg as well. Thank you. Pradnya from Silver Spring. Linda Lawrence from Long Island. Our good friend Stephen Kaplan from Ramsey, New Jersey. Hey, Stephen. Celeste is joining us from Chicago. And Diane Stefani from Margate. She likes wanting to repeat, get media savvy. So Julie, we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. You can explain what that means. But what a great Mark Lee, Miriam Berkeley, Chris Gorman, Eric Jacobson is watching on YouTube. Again, we're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we're also live on Julie's personal Facebook page, her author page, and her Twitter account. So if you're watching from there, make sure you press play on the video if you're watching on Facebook or Twitter so that you actually join us on the video feed.
And we do this every Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. So if this is new to you, we've been doing this for 5 years. And it's a celebration of news and accurate information. And we are independent of the New York Times, but we have folks who worked there, and others joining us throughout the year. So if you'd like to be a guest on the show, or you know someone who should be a guest on the show, please let us know as well.
Absolutely. Vishal Singh from New Delhi. Again, our international audience. We have, and then a local audience, Naomi from the Upper West Side. And Abby is joining us from Boston. And Amy Padnani is joining us as well. Amy was a guest on the New York Times Read Along last fall. She's on the Obits desk and oversaw the Overlooked series, obituaries that the New York Times failed to run when people passed away, particularly women. I think, right? Not just
people of color. Yeah.
And people of color. That's what I was trying to remember. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate that. So Shri, one of the things that we always like to do is acknowledge the team behind the New York Times Read Along. We would not be able to do this without Shri, of course, as the host. I am the executive producer and guest host on occasion. But Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks and Carla Baranauckas are integral parts to our team. One of the things that we do is we make sure that we have people watching in Facebook. That's Paula. Watching in LinkedIn. That would be Steve. Julia helps with analytics and filling in, and she's going to be help prepping our 10 o'clock guest today. And Carla Baranauckas, oh my God, Carla has done such an incredible job getting guests for our show in the last several months. Everyone from New York Times #1 best-selling author Harlan Coben to some luminaries from the New York Times, including Julie and last week's guest, Bill Roden. Carla, thank you so much for everything you've done to help us out. So if you have questions, if you want links to some of the articles that we're talking about, Paula and Steve will help you out. And Carla will be watching on Julie's Facebook pages as well. So if you have any questions, please let her know. And with that, Shri, and I'll just make a note about the odd light coming in. There's a little window, and maybe I'll show it to you later, that if I sit in one spot, it'll get me for like 5 minutes. But we'll work through that.
It's all good. Greetings again to folks who have just joined us. We're about to read the New York Times, and we're so grateful to Julie, our guest for today. Please tell us where you're watching from, and please ask questions. Please share your thoughts on the news of the day. We're about to just look at the print edition of the New York Times, and then Julie will be joining us when we get to the front page. We're going to look at the other sections. Neil's going to give us a tour of the other sections right now.
Absolutely, Shri. So we'll bring on the New York Times camera and take a look at what we have. And we'll just...
There you go. That looks good. And Neil, we can't hear you, so you want to walk us through?
I'm sorry about that, Shri. About now, you should be able to hear me.
Sure.
The pictures on the front page. What I was saying, the doors to the rotunda on Wednesday after law enforcement officers cleared the Capitol. You can clearly see where the windows were smashed in. And reading some of the accounts, just absolutely horrible, absolutely horrific. I want to take a point of personal privilege to do a shout out. Failures of the Capitol Police Force, the leadership and the management, and how they handled kind of at the macro level have been written about. But I do want to mention that my neighbor is a member of the Capitol Hill Police Force. And I know that within that chaos and within the overall mismanagement, individual officers really did what they could at times. There's some that you might question what they were doing, but I know that several really did do what they can. And I want to give a shout out to Steve, my neighbor, who came back just absolutely exhausted, mentally, physically, etc. So thank you, Steve, for your service. America on edge as House weighs second impeachment. That's the lead story today. We're going to be taking a look. We'll take a quick look at the 52 places we love, which is the New York Times 52 places to go for 2021. What's interesting, they focused on reader submissions for this year's piece. But we won't spend too much time, though. We're going to save this for next week because we're going to have the deputy editor, Elizabeth Goodrich, join us next week to talk about how this came together. So we'll definitely take a look at that. The at-home section, Julie was at the at-home desk when she was at the New York Times, so we'll take a close look there. Incredible photo of someone sledding, just one picture. We're heading back up for another run. That's an interesting way of putting it. We're taking the good habits we developed into 2021, and it's really, we're in for a lot for this year. We have Sunday business. Shri, do you do pink socks? I know I couldn't pull them off.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not for the faint of heart. But here's the headline, which talk about a surprise. You're looking at nice pair of shoes. What are they going to be talking about? The new sperm economy. Women are joining Facebook groups to meet willing donors. No middlemen required. Because of shortages, they're doing this on their own apparently, which is interesting. And then this could get ugly, covering the Capitol siege. So again, another reporter's account, April Ryan, White House correspondent. So that's always going to be. And then looks like there's going to be a profile of Raj Shah after a career working on disaster response in the developing world. Disaster hit home. That'll be interesting to take a look at. Raj Shah is at the Rockefeller Foundation and was head of USAID under President Obama. The Sunday Review, I want to point out the Black Tower is here above the
that's quite stunning to see
title,
that.
right? And with the red font to highlight. So if you can't read what happened at the Capitol on Wednesday, can't undo what happened in Georgia on Tuesday. And other headlines, and then the picture, future voter. This is again a Georgia focused.
Did you say something was in red on the cover?
Yes, I'm sorry. If you focus in, this text right here, the index, if you will, is in red.
That's funny. Our colors, at least on my computer, don't look red at all. So that's interesting.
Yeah, interesting. It is actually in red, so that might just be a resolution thing. But that's another way to set off the headlines. The New York Times Magazine piece, you almost can't find the headline there. It's a picture of a rhino. I believe it's a white rhino. Witness to an extinction, an encounter with the last two northern white rhinos on Earth. But when you look at the magazine, and I'll take without the glare,
it looks like a rule.
That line, white line, is the text.
Yeah, it looks like a line.
That's all you have. Book review: The Earth's Extremes, Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World, and Himalaya: A Human History by Ed Douglas. And it's interesting. Looks like it's a reflection of one of the mountains or an iceberg or something on the left. The last two sections we'll take a look at before having Julie join us. Arts and leisure. Dancing is everywhere. All you have to do is look. And this is an interesting, in terms of photography, focusing on the shadow instead of the subject. So we'll take a look at that. And finally, Sunday styles. This is somewhat paired with the sperm economy story. Hooking up during COVID. We may live in a new world with new rules, but the dating scene comes with some familiar problems. So
because you're looking at the style section, we should point out that there's a conversations broken out about socks, and you can see here many different comments about socks. So that's great. And Susan says, "Good morning, dancing with myself." And there's Mina Harris, who we got to interview for an episode with Project Impact, and just great to see her there. The niece of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. She's an entrepreneur and someone who's made an impact already at a relatively young age. It's great to see her being covered in the New York Times.
Absolutely. So that's what the paper holds for you today. This is the large shot of the sections, granted the glare on the magazine. So Shri, should we bring in Julie?
Yes, please.
Absolutely.
And
I'm
Julie,
here, guys. Can you hear me okay?
yes, we can. Thank you, and thank you for being here, Julie. Really glad to have you with us. Good morning, and tell us how your day has gone already.
Good morning. I'm a couple hours in. I have young children who are interested in cold weather sports a lot more than I am. So they get up early and get out of the house, and they're skiing today. I'm tuning in with you from the Catskill Mountains, upstate New York, where there's a lot of snow outside. It's not that easy to get your hands on a hardcover, a paper copy of the New York Times, but I managed to do that this morning.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Excited to be with you.
Thank you. And let me just give you the proper introduction to everyone so they can see. Journalist, author, and justice advocate, former New York Times staff writer, and author of that book right behind you, The Women Who Made New York. You like to say, quit saying fake news, instead get media savvy. So we'll get into various aspects of your career and your life. I would just like to hear your thoughts on seeing that print New York Times. What does that mean to you first when you worked there? And then now that you're not there, what does that mean to you?
We are living in crazy times, but the reality is we humans have always lived in crazy times. And the way that we learn about the world, the way that we get our information is through media and different mediums. And each media has its own set of properties and its own inherent biases. And so one of the things that's wonderful about newspapers is that there's this great tradition of professionally trained editors who make decisions about what news is important and what we should pay attention to. We're only human. Our brains can only process so much information. And the way that information is packaged or shaped or arranged really affects what we think and how we perceive and what we think about. So a great newspaper, just like any other type of media, is very carefully thought through and shaped to emphasize certain information. And in doing so, inevitably, it de-emphasizes other information. So if you're a person who wants to know about the world and you want to know what's going on and you want to be introduced to new ideas as well as keep up with different issues, what greater resources there in American life right now than the Sunday New York Times. The New York Times, every issue, arranges information in different sections to provide you an overview of what's happening in the world. Is it perfect? No. Is it complete? Does it cover absolutely everything? No. But you would be hard pressed to find a better newspaper anywhere in the country or the world in terms of the number of things it's covered, the quality of the coverage, the relentlessness with which the journalists and editors go to fact check and confirm their information, and also the quality of the design. There are incredible designers, photographers, illustrators who work with the journalists and help produce this incredible paper. Every time I get it in my hands, I feel grateful that it exists and I learned something and, get excited about something I hadn't even thought about before.
Awesome. Let me just tell you some of the folks who are watching. Russ Gutstein says, good morning from your cousin in Miami. Feel free to give a shout out to anyone who we.
Hi, Russ. So Russ is my mother's cousin and I've heard this story many times. When I was born, he showed up at the hospital in a tuxedo. So I will always appreciate that gesture, and it's really nice to hear from everybody.
Wow, that's amazing. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone who's done that. So that's awesome. Lauren Young gives you a room rater of 10.
Why, thank you. I do my best, but part of being media savvy, part of understanding media literacy is recognizing that there's a lot of things you can't see and you don't know. So I will share with your audience that despite how fabulous my room looks right now, you really don't know what room I'm in, or the quality of the room, or the cleanliness of the room. So maybe at the end of the show, I'll reveal what a mess I really am calling in from right now.
Just tell us about the backdrop. I see the Taj Mahal on there.
Well, I don't know. This backdrop has been up since beginning of COVID. I relocated to the Catskills for most of 2020 I have 3 sons who have a lot of energy, and I like to give them as much outdoor time as possible. So I get a lot of compliments when I do appearances on my wallpaper, but because images, and especially television, which is kind of what this is, can be deceiving, you should know that this isn't wallpaper. If you look, you can see it's actually fabric. And it has a beautiful block print. I think it's what's his name? Not John Darien. It's a block print with buildings around the world and from Asia. So I think it's a beautiful piece. And at the end of the show, I'll reveal where I got it, but I'm not telling you now.
Oh, wow. Okay, nice tease to the end of the show. Thank you. And folks, a reminder that we'll go till about 10 o'clock with Julie, and then we will be talking about Neil Sheehan, who died this year, legendary reporter at the New York Times, with Janie Scott, who wrote his obituary in the New York Times. Eric is watching from Ottawa. Thank you for joining us. And Naomi says, don't forget the amazing production work in the Queen's printing plant. And
that's an incredible thing to say. I've been to the printing plant, and it is, just the physical act of producing a newspaper every day and getting into the hands of people all over the country is really a modern marvel. The printing plant is incredible. It's huge. The people that work there are highly skilled in what they do. How often do you see errors or mess ups in the print? Almost never. And so on the one occasion I can remember where the red ink kind of slopped over, I was amazing, because you realize what a feat it is that this comes out every day. So I love getting information online because it enables us to get information quickly and from all over the place and without the hassles involved. There's also fewer trees lost in the process of making online information, but you lose something when you get information online. So as we just did this Sunday read along, we looked section by section, and that's actually like a service to your brain, right? It's putting, here's all the information about the arts, here's information about the world, to have it organized that way. It doesn't get organized that way when it's online. You're left to figure that all out for yourself.
Or the algorithm decides what you're going to see next, and things like that. So that's part of the adventure. I just want to say, in 2019, we met Mike Connors, who runs the printing plant, and we did a live New York Times read along on a Wednesday night as the paper came off the press. It was incredible. We had people around the world watching us, and there have been people at the New York Times who hadn't been to the printing plant who enjoyed that as well. So shout out to the folks at the printing plant. Adrienne is watching from New York City, and we have folks watching from all over. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let's take a look at the front page of the New York Times. I'm just going to pull it up here on screen like this so people can see it. And here you can, this is the full page. And let's go in and just talk about some of the stories here. America on edge as House weighs second impeachment. So first, your thoughts on Wednesday and all the things that happened. Where were you? Where were you watching? Your thoughts?
Well, like many people, I was trying to do work, and of course that was near impossible. It was in many ways a shocking sight to behold. In other ways, it was not shocking, right? I mean, this is a president who has, since before he was running for political office, has exploited sort of the lowest common denominator of dog whistles in order to elevate his profile profile in public. If you are media savvy, which is a way of saying you're media literate, you understand that it's very easy to get eyeballs. You just need to say the most salacious thing, the rudest thing. Gail Collins has written a couple of amazing books about the history of gossip in our republic. And, if you want to get lots of people tune in, you're going to say the most damning thing. You are going to say something racist. You're going to say something horrible. So the language that has been used around what's happening politically has just continued to escalate. And so for years now, we have heard an escalation of language surrounding gun restrictions. People who are NRA supporters talk about this idea that people are going to come into your home and confiscate your guns, which there has never been a proposal like that at all, talking about defending your rights. And Donald Trump has just repeatedly used this inflammatory language, and he's used it on different platforms. So it wasn't surprising in that sense to see that many people took him at his word, organized, and showed up to storm the Capitol. And if you listen to the Daily podcast from the New York Times from Friday, there is incredible detail about what was said online and in different chat rooms to prepare people and organize people to come together and show up there. So that part was not surprising, but it was, personally, it was just heartbreaking. Many members of my family have served in the military in different capacities. And, I have so much gratitude to live in a democracy, and I think some understanding of what it means to not have that. And so to see people take action to impede on a sovereign democratic process that was happening in Congress was just heartbreaking. And I encourage people to check out, I've posted it on Facebook, Rebecca Solnit shared it, but it was a first-person account from Erin Schaff, who was a staff photographer for the New York Times, who was inside, and what it was like in those moments to be inside, and specific dangerous language that was aimed at her because they saw that she was a journalist and that she worked for the New York Times. She was scared for her life. So we have a president who has publicly called journalists a threat, an enemy of the people is the language that he used. And, this is a country where journalism is protected in our very founding because our founders understood the importance of a free press. So, terrifying, but I guess not all that surprising, Sheree.
Yeah, we saw that, by the way, the news that came out that the mayor asked for the police, for intervention at 1:34 p.m., but the Capitol wasn't secure till 8 p.m. And imagine during Black Lives Matter events, it was the opposite of all of that. They were ready even before and ready to take out people. What are your thoughts on, and you can see the story on the left side here, who's boss? Two tech giants, exhibition of power in Trump silencing. That Facebook has suspended him for at least 2 weeks until the inauguration, maybe longer, but he's been removed permanently from from Twitter. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I have thoughts, Sri. The issue we have is that when social media came into existence, which wasn't that long ago, it transformed every single human with access to one of these into a mass media publisher. And on the one hand, this gives us something that's great and that we needed. And on the other hand, it takes something away. So what is wonderful about social media, what it gave us, is for the first time in human history, people whose voices had been ignored have access to large audiences and can communicate their messages instantaneously and globally to a massive audience. And that's a good thing. And I think without Twitter, we wouldn't have had Black Lives Matter. I don't think we would have had the Arab Spring. But what is terrible about these platforms is that it enables anybody with access to one of these to have a mass audience instantaneously and globally. And not everybody is going to use that power to positive goals. So just like we had earlier in our history with the invention of radio or other forms of mass media, you have the rise of all kinds of people with less than idealistic intentions spreading their message. And so the fact that Facebook and Twitter are only now acting, I think, is horrible and frankly immoral. I think that as much as I think The Daily is one of the best podcasts in existence, and I'm a huge fan of Mickey Barbaro, I'm pretty upset with them about a recent podcast that they did in which they had a tech reporter describe how a few years ago when Trump first got on Twitter, he said, quote, nobody was thinking about these issues. And that's factually inaccurate. There are entire fields of study about the role of media in shaping human perception and understanding. And there are numerous educators, advocates out there who have been trying to get Facebook and Twitter to pay attention to the dangers that it poses. Facebook internally conducted a study and found that the number one cause for people joining hate groups on Facebook was their own algorithms. Their algorithms are designed to exploit what we know about human nature and send people towards the stories that are most inflammatory, most provocative, and those are the heart of how hate speech works. So I think it's great that these tech giants have stepped up and said we're no longer going to allow Trump to use these platforms, but I think it's deeply troubling and just extraordinary evidence for why the US government is way overdue in rebuilding the FCC and putting some teeth back into regulation. We knew in the 1930s that we had to have some kind of regulation in order to make sure that our mass media was used in appropriate ways and in ways that serve the human interest. And it's for that reason that for decades, you have people on the 6 o'clock news who couldn't say the word crap. There, I said it, because we were trying to keep certain standards of decency, and they have looked the other way and allowed the most indecent type of language to occur on these platforms, spreading hateful rhetoric about immigrants, about people of color, about sexual minorities. It's outrageous. And so it's about damn time they did something. That's what I think. Are you with me, Shri, or
we're having folks tag their friends. Deborah is just doing that. Everyone, please tag your friends. What a great conversation we're having right now. Tag your friends. They can watch now or later. I saw Matilda said facts. So that's great. That the facts that you're spewing and sharing and getting out in the world. Janet Walsh is just joining from Minnesota. And Moriba says, personal information should be regulated and protected like your cash in your bank. And reporting live, Jacob is watching from Dallas, Texas. Chaitna is watching from New Jersey. We have comments and questions coming in for you as well. Mike says, hi, Julie. It's Mike from your hometown. I agree with you that the press should be protected. Social media hasn't changed the world for good and has been used for negativity. Lots of other comments coming in here. We have a question here from Carol Jenkins, who asks, reporters are in grave danger going forward. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are that we need a multi-pronged approach to get this country back on track. I think that just as we've made a mistake in our public education system by eliminating classes that teach basic life skills, things like home ec and shop, we wanted to prepare everybody for the digital future, but there are basic essential skills that you need to be a functioning citizen in society and part of civic society. And part of that is having basic media literacy skills. So I think we need to educate children and adults about how different types of media work, help them understand the difference between journalists and entertainment, the difference between facts and opinion, help them identify the different sections of a newspaper, which I think most adults cannot do, even very well-educated adults. And I think it's the responsibility of media organizations themselves, in addition to the responsibility of government, to make sure that they're doing everything they can to educate their audiences. For example, when I like to think about clothing stores like J. Crew when they started selling cashmere sweaters, and they put up little signs on the table to explain to their customers why they should pay more for cashmere, which is a fiber that costs a lot more to produce. I think that quality journalism is a very different product than the content that floods our airwaves and our websites, and that it's incumbent upon journalist organizations, if they want to survive, to do a better job of educating their audiences. And once you do that, I think once people understand the value of journalism, they're going to be more supportive of protecting journalism. If you follow sort of journalist organizations, it's just been devastating to see how the United States has become a very unsafe place for journalists to practice. I mean, who would have thought, in my lifetime, to see that instead of just, these places in the world that we thought were so backwards and so different, we're no different. It's exactly the same. And there are a lot of risks to journalists here, and we need to keep them. So, there has been incredible growth in subscribership for the New York Times. And I think that's evidence of the fact that people understand you have to pay for journalism. It's a quality product. It requires people and human labor in order to get information and fact check it. And I think that's how we protect journalists. We make sure that their work is valued and understood. There's a reason there's professional journalism. It's wonderful that people can use their phones to provide information when there's an emergency. You hear about citizen journalists and this idea, if there's an emergency and I can hold up my phone and record it, that's a service. But that's not the same thing as providing context and details and getting to the bottom of important problems that we have in society. And we need journalists to do that.
Thank you. I want to just show you other parts of the front page of the New York Times, looking at the other massive story that is such a problem. We've seen now 4,000 people die a day at one point this week, and the surge brings a New York moment to California. In one part of California, one person's dying every 8 minutes. And then here's a story about the vaccines and the rush to expand access. Only a small percentage of the vaccines have been deployed. Your thoughts on these two stories together?
So I'm not a scientist, and I do not know the best way to deploy the vaccine. However, there are people who, I believe in expertise, and I believe in the fact that scientists who spend decades studying the way vaccines work, the way viruses work, the best methods to protect public health are the ones that we should listen to. And so, it's absolutely devastating, the situation that we're in now. One of my dearest friends lives in LA, and, she has not left her apartment in about a year. And, she has been not only working remotely and relying on food deliveries, but, she's taking care of her mother, who has some medical conditions that put her in a high-risk category. And she has two nephews who are young and face a different kind of threat. And so, we're all in this situation now, and it's positively devastating to me to see that we weren't able to get this under control, and that we're now continuing to face a virus that is causing so much harm, not only to the people who are infected, but a whole population of people now that are called long haulers who have managed to recover for now, but are dealing with symptoms that reoccur, and we really don't know much about how this is going to continue to show itself throughout their lives. And also the medical workers and the people on the front lines. My uncle's a nurse, and he works in the Rhode Island, Boston area. And, to have so many colleagues who have given up so much, who have sacrificed so much to protect the health and safety of the rest of us. Those are the people I just keep thinking about every day. So I'm really hopeful for this idea that the Biden-Harris administration has put out already, that they're going to ask Americans for 100 days, 100 days of sacrifice to wear masks, stay in, because really that's all it would take, right? If everybody stayed put and we could control the spread, we know that we could have this thing under control in 100 days. So the question is whether Americans will make that sacrifice.
Thank you. Tim says, yes, so disturbing, and we have to explain this to our children. Jen Singer says, long hauler here. We couldn't get it under control because of misinformation spread via social media. How do we combat that? You talked about that a little bit already. Chetna says, just got my second dose of Pfizer last week and so thankful for that. She is a frontline worker in the medical profession. Ron Thomas, greetings from Verona, New Jersey. He's usually in Dubai, but he's now in New Jersey. And Eddie says, a Facebook algorithm increased membership of Facebook hate groups. And a lot of pushback, of course, now on all that's happening. Russ says, in Florida, persons over 65 have been put at the front of the COVID vaccine line. Thankfully, Robin and I received our first shot January 7th. So we're glad to hear that. Mark asks, your thoughts on podcasts and streaming and that kind of journalism and media?
So, I mean, I love podcasts, and what I love about them is, like radio, it's a very intimate experience. You're listening and you feel very close to the speakers. It's also a longer form. I remember the day at the New York Times when we were called into a conference room and told, if you don't have a Twitter account, you need to set one up. And if you don't use it, we'd like you to become active on it, because there was this sense, as often happens at media organizations, historically in television and elsewhere, when a new form of media is introduced, there's this feeling like, unless we participate, we're going to somehow miss out. And there might be some truth to that. But at the same time, I remember in that meeting thinking about how, until that moment, I always considered my value as a journalist was in the fact that I didn't speak out publicly every time I had a thought, and that I didn't share my opinion on anything until I had spent extensive time researching it, fact checking it, talking to experts, and making sure I had every possible piece of information available in order to know I was making the best possible assessment. And so, there's always been this tension in the field of journalism between treating journalists like celebrities and trying to sort of cultivate recognition of us as individuals. But I also think that that's really part of the mess that we've gotten ourselves in, because as a journalist, my brand, if I was branding myself, is that, hello, it's not all about you. You need to pay attention to what else is going on in the world and who else lives in your society and your world, and you need to pay attention to them. So, what I like about podcasts, again, it's another way for journalists and writers and storytellers and entertainers to share with us things that can't be communicated in a soundbite. Shri, you're generously letting me talk in complete sentences, but as we know, when you go on television, you're supposed to talk in sound bites. And it's not because people's ears don't work, but the way the nature of visual media work is that people don't tune in for too long. So when I host events, I cut my guests off much more quickly than you cut me off, because I know with one voice going on this long, people tend to tune out. And so what's wonderful about podcasts is that they're structured to keep our attention, but you can pay attention for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and learn something with more complexity and depth than you otherwise would. So that's another reason I love the Sunday paper, so that you can read long articles and learn things.
Thank you. Some great comments and folks watching. Our friend Therese Steiner is watching from Redondo Beach in California. Sandra is watching from West Virginia. And Mark's dad and his girlfriend are getting the vaccine in 2 weeks in the 80s and 70s. Sudha Parekh, mother of Neil Parekh, is watching. It's a challenge to explain about the Capitol tragedy to young children. How did you handle the situation explaining it to young folks?
So, I think that getting media savvy or being media literate is actually an essential thing for parents. And part of how I came to this idea was hearing from highly competent people that I know about their struggle to talk about Donald Trump and what was happening in society and in the media. And I think that when it comes to talking to children, and in a way, it's just like the work that professionals in major media organizations need to think. There's all kinds of people in this world, and they bring different capacities and levels of understanding to any subject that they are curious about. And so when you're trying to tell children about what happened, I start with the broadest possible outline, and I help them understand that what a democracy is. And I explain that what's wonderful about our country is that we operate by the rule of law, and no matter how you feel, you're allowed to be angry, you're allowed to be hurt, you're allowed to not like something, but that doesn't mean you get to act on your behaviors. And the reason we have a democracy and the reason we go by laws is so that no one individual can take their feelings or opinion and force it upon other people. And that what happened in Washington this week, first of all, was that the president, despite the fact that he doesn't like the outcome of the election, is not understanding that he is not entitled, just like the person who was dubbed Soho Karen, who basically attacked a child because she was scared that she lost her cell phone. You're entitled to feel however you want, but that doesn't entitle you to go into action. And so we saw a group of people who did not like the outcome of the election think that they were entitled to act, and they are not. They violated laws, and they're going to be held accountable. So, that's how I explained it to my children. But I'm always having conversations with my children about the information that they get. I like to ask them sort of, when they tell me some amazing statistic, I'm like, that's really interesting. Where did you hear that? And we talk about sort of what kind of resources online are reliable and which aren't. What is the difference between an encyclopedia and a blog? Sort of how can we discern between different types of information? I think that media literacy skills are really like nothing short of a survival skill for the 21st century. And that opinion is not original. There's a group of historians at Stanford who joined together a few years ago called the Stanford Historian Education Group. And they conducted a massive study of tens of thousands of middle, high school, and college students and evaluated their ability to discern different types of information online. Can they tell the difference between journalism and advertising, promotion, press, partisan, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically propaganda. And they could not discern. And these historians concluded that the outlook for civic society was very grim unless we change that. So, to help my children navigate this world, because every day they're inundated with messages on social media, videos on TikTok, I'm constantly trying to give them language to talk about these basic principles and then the specifics of each specific news event.
Thanks. I just want to tell folks that we are talking to Julie Scelfo, who is the author of that book behind her, The Women Who Made New York, and a former New York Times staff writer. She's a justice advocate. We'll hear about that aspect of her work. And we'll go right now, in just a minute, to look at the rest of the print paper. We have about 40 minutes with Julie, and then we'll be joined by Jani Scott to talk about Neil Sheehan's Obituary, which he wrote this week when he passed. Tim Sohn says, your description for children is so clear. Thank you. We have 2 children, ages 9 and 6. And Mary C. Curtis is watching. She's watching from Charlotte, and she's your op-ed project colleague and wonderful former guest on this show. And
podcast too. I mean, Mary's an incredible columnist and podcaster, and everybody should follow her if they're not already. When I don't know how to process the week's news, I go to Mary. So she's
M. Curtis NC3 on Twitter from North Carolina. There's too many comments here to share, and maybe you'll go back and look at them later, Julie. But Deborah says that my Holocaust survivor relatives would talk to me about how to recognize the social and political cues to identify fascism and prevent it from happening in society today. When I raised the alarm among my friends and family about Trump in 2015, I was called an alarmist. Today, I'm terrified at how close we came to another dictatorship here in the U.S. I think she's spot on in describing what has happened with Trump. I would say about 2015 and 2016, I said it's like 1932 in Berlin, and people thought I was exaggerating. And this is how close we came. I think many people made the point this week that the first time Hitler tried to come to power, it was the beer hall putsch was badly done and failed, and he wasn't punished for it in any serious way, and that's how he was able to come back to power and obviously have such an impact. So we have to be all very, very careful about what happens. Hi, Neil.
Hey, how are you doing? I wanted to jump in just to get back to the question that my mom asked out actually earlier about explaining it to kids, and just give a 7-year-old's perspective. My daughter Emily asked this week just a very basic question. We live in Springfield, Virginia, not far, and I mentioned our neighbor is a Capitol Hill police officer. She just asked simply, are they going to come here and attack our house?
And how did you answer, Neil?
And of course, I mean, Julie, I mean, we assured her that she was safe. We held her tight. We said that, we explained to her what was going on. She saw some of the footage that's happening over there, but we are safe where we are, that we're going to protect her. And she was satisfied with that. But for me, it really just brought it home, and how simple that question is. It's not, I mean, we've talked to her about democracy. She knows about elections. She knows about the difference between here and Egypt. We've lived in Egypt before, so we make that comparison. But it's just a question about basic safety at some point. And I just wanted to share that thought.
And that. Go ahead, Sheree. I don't mean to cut you off.
Please go ahead.
I mean, that's part of. In my work as a journalist, I've spent a lot of time covering mental health. I've covered breaking news. I've written a lot about women, and I've always tried to write stories that help uncover and unpack why people think what they think. There's this idea that journalists are supposed to be skeptical, and I'm always skeptical. But rather than distrust everybody I interview, I try to believe everything they say, meaning try and understand why they believe it and unpack why they have those beliefs. And if you can do that, and you can go down, you understand how what happened this week in Washington happened. So, for children, this idea of basic safety, and for many Make America Great supporters, these are people who really believe that their way of life is under threat. And I think the question of race in this country is one that people are able to see a lot more clearly now in sort of the response of law enforcement to what happened this week in Washington as compared to what happened with Black Lives Matter. Certain people are treated as more of a threat, whether or not that is factually accurate. And mistreating people and the ongoing mistreatment of people and the lack of justice with how different people in society are treated is this problem that permeates everything. So I don't think it's wrong to recognize the links between the MAGA momentum and frustration with what's the decline of white supremacy and the decline of having our institutions dominated by white men. I love white men. I've made white men. I have 3 sons. So I am not insensitive to the fact that everybody needs to feel like they belong. At the same time, we need to have ways of talking and communicating that are inclusive and that make it clear that if we're going to have a democracy where every citizen is entitled to a vote and basic human rights, that everybody needs to be part of that conversation. And, Amy Padani messaged before, like she did with her beautiful Overlooked series, that is such a simple way of acknowledging these basic facts, these real things that happen, these real people's lives that we know now had an impact, were completely ignored. And that's something, we just can't continue to do.
Thank you very much. We're at 9:25, which means we have about 30 minutes with Julie Scelfo, who has been giving us such great insight today about trying to understand the media landscape. I'm going to ask Neil to show us the rest of the paper and give us a tour, and then we can have Julie weigh in as she looks at some of the other coverage, including the at-home section, which you used to work at. So if you could just tell us about being there with the at-home section?
So, when I was there, it was the home section. And, throughout the history of the New York Times, one of the things I love about the Times is they're willing to experiment and try different sections. And, so the home section was a place where you could go to learn about design and, sort of the interior life of domesticity. It also had a lot of design stuff. And while I was there, I tried to do stories about sort of how we live at home. And after I left the paper, they decided to stop having the home section. Some of the content would appear in the real estate section. But now that we're all at home, it makes so much sense to bring it back. And I'm glad they've done that. So, I'm a big fan of using all kinds of subjects as windows into what brings everybody together and what we all have in common. I think it's important to also talk about different groups and specific identities, but fundamentally, I'm a humanist, and I think everybody needs to be included. So here in the home section, it's looking at the new essentials right now, video games, or here are activities you can do at home. I mean, everybody in this country right now is spending more time at home, right? So unless you don't have a home. So, I also used to push and do stories about homelessness in the home section. But I love seeing all of these sort of creative ideas about things to keep you busy, including that. Actually, I was reading that chicken cacciatore recipe this morning right there. One pot cooking, slow cooker, I'm all for it.
This is definitely a great section, Julie, and this is the evolution, as you were mentioning, and we'll talk about the 52 places to go, the travel section. In I think it was March or April. In April, they stopped publishing the travel section. It didn't make sense during the pandemic. So the pivot was at home, not even a home section, but at home. What's happening within your house? What are people doing? Another headline: Stop blaming cities. The coronavirus is everywhere. Another piece about movies, Delight in the Power of Superheroes, specifically about Wonder Woman.
Yeah, I mean, tying it back to social media literacy, this morning, a journalist who I admire put out a tweet about how frustrated she was that some people got to escape the city, and this journalist is living in a small apartment with an infant. So that tweet was really, about her frustration, which is totally legitimate and hard, about managing an infant in a small apartment while working. But the thing is, you can't escape coronavirus, right? So that piece you just showed us in the at-home section this week is looking at the fact that coronavirus is everywhere. It's not about cities. It's not about the country. Public health people understand that this is, it's kind of like when AIDS started and we talked about it as a virus that had something to do with being homosexual. It's a virus. It affects human beings, and we're all affected. So I think that's why sort of the public health perspective is so important. And I didn't know about the decision to stop publishing the travel stuff. I mean, even though we can't travel right now, I am personally, making lots of travel lists of where I want to go when this ends. But, I wonder if advertising has something to do with that, right? I mean,
well, sure.
The newspapers used to be completely dependent on advertising. And if there was a lot of advertisers spending money, then they would be able to have a bigger advertising section. Travel section. If there were a lot of car companies spending money, they could have an automotive section. One of the challenges that the home section faced, I know, was that Styles actually, took their advertising. There were a lot of design companies, furniture companies that used to publish in the home section, but then they were like, oh, do we go to Styles? And sort of how do you decide? So one of the things that's wonderful about the way Times the Times has undertaken to become sufficient on subscription fees as opposed to advertising is that it frees them up from that obligation or that dependency, I guess is a better word. So I'm sure advertising has something to do with it.
Sure, and we'll take a look at the front page section as well. What we've seen in the last several weeks of doing the read along, that there are still some tourism bureaus that are doing ads, which are interesting enough. And there's a particular city in Florida that has been pushing, it has an ad campaign of, kind of looking what it's like 50 years from now. Don't you wish you had traveled there? And I'm very intentionally avoiding pronouncing this city in Florida that starts with KISS, because I'm not going to get it right. I just won't, unless you can pronounce it, Julie.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Neil.
We'll get to it. We'll get to it, I'm sure.
Let their advertising speak for itself.
The special version of 52 Places is the Times Insider piece. And as I mentioned, Elizabeth Goodrich will be our guest next week. But this was the whole idea of what they did is they collected user photos and stories instead of sending out Times writers, which is interesting. Kiss Simi is what Russ is coaching me on. So we'll see if they have that ad in today's paper. We have a full page ad about an Amazon original movie about Stacey Abrams, which is definitely interesting.
I can't wait to watch that. I'm very curious about that. The producers of that are really interesting. I like their work. I'm excited to see it.
Absolutely. And tracking an outbreak, a rigorous approach is keeping cases off campus. So this is the National University of Singapore. Looks like they're having more success than a lot of U.S. campuses in dealing with coronavirus.
And this is a huge issue. I mean, I have friends that work in higher education. There are 3 young people in my family who just this year are having their senior year of high school. They have lost their prom. They have lost all of their experiences, graduation. They're applying to colleges that they can't visit. And then I have a lot of young friends who are in their first or second year of college, and it's a radically different experience than anything previous generations have known. And a lot of campuses are still figuring out how to do this. So I think we're going to be seeing the after effects of this for a long time. And for all the people who are sending in pronunciations of that Florida city, you should know I was born in Miami, and I do know how to pronounce that city, but I just thought that, I would let them attract their own people and not highlight their advertisement.
Yeah, I hear you. Talking about travel, one of the things that they did do in terms of they started the blog The World Through a Lens. So after April, after they stopped the travel section, they did start pushing out some travel stories. And this is a great piece about a wintry Swedish wonderland. And you see a nice picture of the Northern Lights and some reindeer, which is certainly appropriate time-wise. There's another great picture as well. So there is still some travel journalism happening. Here's more on tracing an outbreak. New York moment, surge batters Southern California. That was from the front page. Here is an interesting story. The White House task force. False reports of U.S. variant originated with Dr. Birx.
Okay, so, Neil, the headline is a way of communicating in just a few words what the story is basically about. But the story spells out in greater detail what actually happened. So this scientist, Dr. Birx, was hypothesizing something that might be going on. And various people overheard that and repeated it everywhere. So I think it's appropriate for a scientist to put forward hypotheses, especially when they're working in public health and trying to solve things. The fact that it was reported on as a fact is what's problematic here. And, this headline, is not perfect, but it's not a headline's job to communicate everything. That's what the story's for. So what was false was this idea that her hypothesis about a new strain was a fact. But she indeed did make this hypothesis. So again, this is why sound bites or headlines are not enough to communicate. And a bigger issue that's happening in journalism and at the New York Times and everywhere is that as there's fewer copy editors and as there's less time spent on headlines, we're seeing that they don't always convey information, sorry, I think that's me, as accurately as we like them to. It's also a bigger problem, I think, on websites that are, using SEO to sort of optimize clicks. So that's another way that readers need to be savvy in how they think about the information that they're getting.
They need to get media savvy.
Yes.
Right. International, here's another story. In cold and rain, farmers defying India's leader dig in. This is about the farm protests in India. Shri did an episode of his Shri show devoted to this. So this has been, the number of farmers that are participating, I'm seeing if there's a number in here, has been incredible. And there have been rallies in the States as well. I know that in all places, Kent, Washington, south of Seattle, had a very large rally, I think 10,000 people there in support of Indian farmers from the northern regions, Sikhs from Punjab and other places. Hong Kong site listing police data is blocked, and a lawsuit over a memorial divides community traumatized by massacre. This was in Norway at the site of the 2011 shooting attack. So now we get into the national section, the terrorism. For loyal Trump base, anti-democratic ideals and distrust still burn. This quote, "We are fed up. There are so many people fed up with how crooked it is. I really don't have respect for our Congress anymore."
So, Neil, there was a story in yesterday's paper looking at the use of the word terrorism. And
yes,
those of us who study the effects of language have been thinking about language and the word terrorism for a long time. Is a terrorist the same as a freedom fighter, as the same as a liberator? The British would have called the founding fathers of this country terrorists, perhaps. And so it's really tricky to figure out which are exactly the right word to use. I think insurgents is absolutely correct. And the Times also had a piece, a wonderful interview. Was it the Times? Sorry, I think I saw that on Twitter. But a scholar of revolution sort of talked about what sedition is and the definition of sedition. And sedition absolutely applied to what we saw the other day. When I think of terrorism, I tend to think of people who use fear to intimidate. So maybe terrorists is a good fit too. But the challenge is sort of, when do we use these words and how can we have some kind of common understanding of what they mean? It was a lot easier. I basically began my career at Newsweek. And, even just 15, 20 years ago, this was a country where we were dominated by three major television broadcasts. There was maybe one or two 24-hour news stations, and every single morning, Monday morning in the country, the three major news weeklies, Newsweek, Time, and U.S. News, would come out. And the TV producers would all look at that, and it would help guide what they were going to talk about. So that was a way we could have a national conversation, and that more or less everybody in the country's attention would be directed towards certain things. Now we live in a completely different information environment where there are millions of websites. There are people who are getting their news exclusively from Facebook, exclusively from TikTok, or exclusively from a chat group they belong to. And they're not hearing the same information and therefore having the same reality as everybody else. So I think unless we address these fundamental issues, we're not going to be able to have these bigger conversations about what is a terrorist and why should we view them that way, and why is that the appropriate word?
And as you were talking, I had that article about sedition,
yep.
the history of sedition on the screen.
Right.
Here is some of the other pictures. Again, the continuation, America on the Edge as House weighs new impeachment case. The photos and videos lead to arrests of Trump loyalists. So that's going to be an ongoing story as they work to track people down. Let's see, what else do we have? And then these are more images. If you didn't see the invasion coming, and sorry about the light coming through the window, but if you didn't see the invasion coming, you weren't watching Michigan. So that's an interesting touch point. Of course, Michigan is where there was a plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer back over the summer. And there were also rallies at the state capitol. I know that there were rallies in Olympia, Washington. I lived in Washington State for 15 years and worked in the legislature. A colleague of mine said they actually did storm the governor's mansion in Olympia.
And I love that headline, Neil. I mean, I feel like that headline makes it very clear, if you didn't see the invasion coming, you weren't watching. I mean, there's been so many examples of this. And there have been so many scholars who have tried to, for the last 4 years, explain the import of the language that Trump uses. Even there have been a lot of educators who have been talking about the dangers of the president's language in terms of how it affects our children. I mean, how as a teacher, as a second grade teacher, as Neil, your daughter's teacher, I mean, how do you explain to your children why using their bodies and using violence is not acceptable when you have someone in office making jokes about the fact that police should be rough with people that they arrest? So, I think that's a great headline. It communicates quickly, that this information has been available to those who are willing to look at it.
I want to point out this section is, again, a section, attack on the Capitol, if you see at the top of the page. And this one is lasting images, scenes of insurgency. So some great photography, really evocative images. This is staff taking the certifications to make sure that they were safe. Imagine if they had been left behind, if the insurgents, if the mob had actually gotten a hold of those and destroyed them, what would that have done to the process? You see here the confrontation. And then this is my, not this angle necessarily. There's one that's more from 6 o'clock, if you will, facing the door, but with the law enforcement officers, guns drawn toward the door of the chamber. That's, to me, that's the image that I focused on.
And Neil, this just, I think that's another sort of excellent reminder of the power of different types of media. I mean, photography communicates things that words can't, right?
Absolutely.
I remember on September 11th, actually, after the towers had come down, and I was downtown in Lower Manhattan with my notepad and pencil, going into a few stores and trying to find a disposable camera because I didn't have a camera with me. And this was when cell phones, the cameras in them were not so sophisticated, because the visual power of what was happening, I thought was something that people really needed to see. So, the Times has just incredible photography, the staff photographers, people like David Gonzalez, Teju Cole, their photo critics, John Leland. The work that they did on their Lens blog, I think, is a great resource for your viewers and your listeners in case they want to check it out to see more photography. But if I can also go back to the question your mom asked about sort of talking
Sure.
to children, I think it's also important and a challenge to us all as adults to recognize that, there's too much information now and there's too much imagery for kids. I remember taking my oldest son when he was like 7 years old. We were in the backseat of a taxi in New York going to like a puppet show. And on the TV screen, there was a report about an axe murderer on the Upper East Side who had just chopped people up and how there were body parts and blood all over the apartment. And it was in scroll going across the screen. And I was like, here's my little kid in the middle of what's supposed to be a happy day. He does not need this news right now. Frankly, I didn't either. I watch a lot of news, I consume a lot of news, but I don't need news and information in every environment that I'm in. And so I think with children, it's important not to always keep the TV on in the background running, not to discuss every detail of these things with them. It's too much, and we adults are not wired. My partner in Get Media Savvy work is a media and neurobiological researcher named Heidi Boisvert, and she has conducted studies that show how the brain reacts to all this media we take in, and we can't handle it. It is too much, and we're seeing a rise in mental health problems, anxiety, and I think to protect children, it's very important that we limit what they see and structure when and how we present it to them.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you if you can talk a little bit. It's 9:40, just to 9:45 rather. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about your book, The Women Who Made New York. You can find details about it on Julie's website, juliescelfo.com. A couple of the blurbs: a welcome antidote to male-centered history. From David Byrne, a must-read for anyone who loves New York, filling every page with fresh stories and great details about the fascinating and important women we all should know but don't. Jonathan Alter, and what would New York City be without women? Not much. These women are my muses. Zach Posen. Julie, tell us a little bit about the book.
So the book is a history of New York City, and it's a collection of biographies about the women who made New York. And it goes from the 1600s until the present day. And it was sort of a challenge when I wrote this book, because originally the plan was to feature about 25 to 30 women. But as I did my research and as I collected names of women who had made important contributions, I began to lose sleep at night, because I realized that by editing out so many people and by only featuring 25 people, I was kind of committing the same error of omission that has just happened too long throughout our history. When you go back and you look at all the major histories of New York City, including the Encyclopedia of New York, and you go through the indices, each index, and you run your finger down, which I did to sort of get ideas to get started, you see that there's not a lot of women. And so it sort of begs the question, where were the women? Did they not exist? We know they existed. So either they were doing things that historians did not consider important, or they were doing nothing at all, which is not believable, or they were doing things that we didn't value. And so in the book, what I ultimately decided to do was, rather than just feature 25 or 30 women, I featured 25 different facets of New York City life, and included several women in each chapter who sort of made that facet of New York. So some of them are really obvious, like Broadway or Wall Street or Harlem. But I also wanted to include topics that get more at the essence of the spirit of New York, and New York's role in sort of being a home for progressive thinkers and activists, and workers who were trying to build a democratic society, an inclusive society, and a more civilized society where there was basic things like education and hygiene for everybody. So you had asked me earlier if I wanted to talk about a few specific women. Do you still want me to do that, Neil?
Absolutely.
So, one of my favorite women is Sarah Josephine Baker. And this is not Josephine Baker, the performer, but Sarah Baker was one of the first female physicians in the United States. And she was the first woman to go work for a public health agency. And in 1901, she went to work for the New York City Department of Health. Because she was the only woman there, she cut her hair short and she used to dress like a man, basically because she didn't want to stand out and she didn't want to talk about being a woman all day. She wanted to practice medicine. And so she got a lot of the crappy jobs. And one of them was going into the tenements because a lot of her colleagues didn't want to go there. It was too dirty. But after spending time there, she realized quite quickly that one of the reasons so many children and infants were dying was just because of the lack of basic hygiene. So she implemented all kinds of innovations. But one of my favorite stories about about her was how she dealt with a different public health crisis, and that was smallpox. The vaccine became available, and she, like a few other people in the health department, were given an area of the city on the Lower East Side where it was her job to make sure everyone got inoculated. And that included the Bowery, but she, her deputies could not get these, a lot of the men who were sort of like, drunks passed out on the street to come in. So you know what she did, Neil? She took the vaccines to them at midnight. She walked around in the dark of night and just went up to people while they were asleep and like stabbed them in the leg to make sure they got the vaccine. I mean, can you imagine that happening today?
One way to vaccinate a population. We have a couple of questions that came in about whether the book is available on Audible.
Yes, it is. It was late to become an audiobook. I don't know why the publisher took their time with that, but it has a wonderful reader, and it's on Audible. Yeah.
And Paula shared the link to Audible in Facebook. If you're watching on Shree's Facebook page, you can find the link there. And Susan is sharing a comment, the book that's been optioned.
Yes, it's true. The book has been optioned by Warner Brothers, and there is a TV project in the works. So I don't say too much about it because I'm sort of waiting for that to happen in the right time. But it's very exciting, and these women's stories are incredible and they're timeless. When I admit that I was never interested in history. I think it might be a byproduct of growing up in south of the Mason-Dixon line, where the Civil War relics were all around me, and every single field trip when I was a kid was to a battlefield. So I was like not interested in history. But when I started looking into this, I was just amazed at how similar the struggles that people faced a century ago, 2 centuries ago, were basically the same as what was happening today. I mean, while I was writing this, or when it came out, one of my favorite women in the book is named Eve Adams, and she was an immigrant from Poland who was probably what we would call transgender, even though that word didn't exist back then. But she opened a tea parlor in Soho, and writers used to come, and she just wanted it to be a safe space where women could talk about their sexuality, something that was considered, taboo in the 1920s. So when there was a crackdown, an undercover officer went in there, and Eve showed her a piece of writing she had done, a fictionalized story that included lesbian sex. And so under the guise of obscenity, they arrested her, jailed her, and eventually deported her. And she pled with the court not to deport her. She had been a tax-paying New York City business owner for more than a decade. And after she was deported, she was eventually picked up by the Nazis and murdered at Auschwitz. And so that story brought home for me how real these crises are, and how ongoing the struggle is to allow every human being these, basic human rights to live safely and honestly and openly, and with respect. So, this happened at the same time that Trump was making all kinds of incendiary comments about immigrants. And it's happened at the same time that issues of transgender rights continue to be a big issue in this country and a big concern.
One other profile in the book, if you don't mind sharing, you mentioned that Dr. Uma Mysore is in the book from the Hindu Temple of New York.
I'll hold up her picture.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, the book, one of the best things about the book has nothing to do with me. There are these beautiful illustrations by a painter named Hallie Heald, and this is one. And just so you know how good Hallie is, Dr. Mysore called me after she saw this, and she wanted to know why we chose this photograph, because she thought it wasn't the best photograph of her. And I had to explain that this was an original painting from Hallie. But Dr. Mysore is in the book in one of my favorite chapters, which I call the aunties. And, I'm blessed. I've had some really wonderful aunts in my family who I'm close to. And I think all, the role that aunts serve in life, is to do that thing where they're both your biggest cheerleader and they kick you in the butt when you need it. And, you know, there were a lot of women who were vital parts of different ethnic groups in New York in helping them both assimilate to American society and life in New York. And by assimilate, I mean feel at home there and comfortable and feel a sense of ownership, but also hang on to their cherished traditions from back home. And Dr. Meisterkar was exactly that kind of person. You know, when she moved to Queens, she wanted a place where she and her fellow Hindus could worship, and there was no Hindu temple in the entire United States at that time. And she helped build the first one and make it happen. And because she's so community-minded, she noticed that in Flushing, the most diverse neighborhood in the most diverse borough of the most diverse city in the United States, there were a lot of elderly people who needed a community center and a place to go. So she began running programs at the temple, and eventually when they needed more space, she was part of the committee that fundraised. She donated $1 million of her own money and built the new Ganesh temple there, which is still a big part of community life. So, you know, people like her, people like Antonia Pantoja, who's an incredible figure in the Puerto Rican community and a pioneer of getting bilingual education and ESL classes into New York City schools. You know, I wanted a way to talk about them, so I named them the aunties.
Sure. And we had the pleasure of working with Dr. Uma on the 45th anniversary of the installation at the New York Temple last year, and also did an event on the 4th of July for them through our firm Digimentors. That was an incredible honor to work with them on that. So thank you. And
well,
Pawan is
you
saying
acknowledge that they have dosa there too. I mean, that's a very important. Their cafeteria offers dosa, which, you know, if like me, you're not eating out as much during COVID and desperately missing dosa.
The canteen food there is better than in the restaurants that are nearby that also serve South Indian food, but it's fantastic. And if you haven't, you know, when things are better, I encourage folks in New York to check out the Hindu temple in Flushing and go down to the basement canteen. It's fantastic. We're almost out of time here, Julie. What are some things you want to leave our audience with? Some final thoughts.
You know, this has just been an incredible week and in this country, and I was very moved by the speech given by Macron about the history of France and the United States in terms of allowing democracy to grow and to thrive. I think that what I learned doing this book was the importance of studying history. There's a wonderful organization called Facing History and Ourselves, and they work to educate people about the horrible things that humans have done. And, you know, some people think that if you talk about it, somehow you're going to replicate it. But I think if you don't talk about it, if you don't acknowledge the ways in which our habits, our practices omit people, certain people, and also deny certain humanity, that we're just bound to to repeat the same errors. And so I guess, you know, the thought I would leave people with this week is to slow down, keep taking some deep breaths, take your news from trustworthy sources like the New York Times, like other well-established news organizations. Turn off the talking heads that just fill endless hours with comments that maybe get you worked up, and go deep on a few subjects and read up on it. If you're interested in getting media savvy, and
it's 10 o'clock.
Sorry, I'm on my 10-year-old's computer, so he has some interesting things programmed I'm just learning about. But if you're interested in learning more about media literacy, I have a bunch of free resources on my website, and I'm going to be rolling out some more stuff in the year to come. But Shri, and Neil and Carla, everybody at the New York Times Read Along team, thank you so much for having me. I love that you do this, and I love that the community also chimes in and shares their experience with reading the paper. This is how media gets made, and and there are always humans making decisions about what we read, what we see. And the more we can learn about who those humans are and why they're making the decisions that they make, I think the more equipped we are to decide about, what we want to consume.
And here's your website, the Get Media Savvy page. 4 tools will help you think more critically about any type of media you see. What motivated this message? What information might be missing?
I did a TED talk. Ties into I gave a TED talk about this subject, and it was challenging. They gave me 6 minutes to, compose 25 years of study, to pack it in and sort of explain it as tightly as I could. And that's the challenge with quality media, is to communicate things as concisely as you can. And it's not always easy, but people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And unless we exercise this muscle of thinking critically, reading in-depth, detailed pieces of information, unless we continue to insist our children, practice doing this, reading long-form stories, I think, it's pretty scary. But I think we're gonna lose this skill. We didn't always have it. Our species did not always have it.
Absolutely.
Just want to point out that Naomi has ordered 2 books, one for me and one for my budding journalist niece. Great work and insightful segment. And with that, Neil, let's thank Julie for joining us. And folks, don't go anywhere. We are going to continue for a few minutes with a special guest. Neil, over to you.
Julie, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Whoops. Sorry for cutting you off, Julie. So Shri, our next segment, before we go to our next segment, want to take a moment. Next week's guest on the read-along, as I mentioned earlier, will be Elizabeth Goodrich, the deputy editor of the New York Times travel section. And she led the publication of this year's 52 Places to Go, which is actually 52 places we love. So we are looking forward to having her on the show. We also want to thank our sponsor, MuckRack. Shri, can you talk a little bit about the work we do with MuckRack?
Sure. Well, big thanks to MuckRack. I've been an advisor to them. They've done so many great things to connect journalists and communications professionals of all kinds. So please check out muckrack.com. And if you'd like to be a sponsor of the New York Times Read Along, please contact me or Neil. You see the contact information here. Big thanks to Greg Gallant and Mike Schneider and Emma Haddad for the work we do together.
Absolutely. And then we also want to share your newsletter, Shri, from this week.
Yes, I want to just tell everybody that I have a newsletter that I write every week, and it's really focused on trying to understand what is happening in the world of digital and media aspects of it. And we have a story today, obviously looking at the crisis in DC, and want to also tell everybody that you can subscribe to it by going to srinet.substack.com, srinet.substack.com, and we talk about the permanent ban of Donald Trump by Twitter and so much more. Please do check that out, srinet.substack.com.
And we're going to see whether we can pull that up. Do we have that out yet?
Yeah, it's out today, so everyone please check that out. Thank you.
Great. And then what we'll do is to bring on Janie Scott. We want to talk about this incredible story, Neil Sheehan, who led the publication of the Pentagon Papers at the Times. And Janie is going to join us, tell us a little bit about the story about how he got the Pentagon Papers. So we'll bring on Janie Scott. Janie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Appreciate it. So this is the story that came out, how Neil Sheehan got the Pentagon Papers. How long was this story in the making?
Well, the whole journey, to use a cliche, began in 2013. I was working on the advance obituary of Neil Sheehan, as the paper prepares obituaries for people who are likely to be newsworthy, and their deaths be newsworthy long in advance in many cases. And I'd been assigned this one, and I'd done quite a lot of research on it, and realized that the one big hole in the obituary was that I could find no evidence on the public record, which was extensive on Neil Sheehan, that he'd ever spoken directly about how exactly he got the Pentagon Papers. It was widely known that they had been leaked to the Times by Daniel Ellsberg, but for some reason, Neil Sheehan's account was missing. Which made me curious. And I realized, of course, I couldn't write the obituary without having tried to get him to explain it. So I wrote him a letter asking if he'd talk to me and saying that I had noticed this. And he said, I'm in the middle of working on a memoir, and I don't want to do it right now, but I may talk to you. So in 2015, he did agree to talk to me on the condition that nothing that he said would be published before his death, and that it would be entirely in confidence between us. So I went to Washington and did a 4-hour interview with him in his house, and he told me this just absolutely eye-popping story, as I say in the piece, an account that was worthy of a Hollywood movie, many Hollywood movies, and I had left the Times and was doing these advanced obituaries on the side and writing books. And I had a book contract and was in the middle of a book. And so I couldn't get the piece written because I was getting close to my book deadline. So I was planning to get it done, but it was sort of burning a hole in my computer, the transcript of this 4-hour interview. And finally, when I finished the book in 2018, I got the thing written and submitted it, and it was edited and then stashed away in an inaccessible place in the Times system with an edict at the top of it saying this is in no way to be used before the obituary. So sure. I had written the obituary and the sidebar. So it was a long process.
And Amy is weighing in. She was one of the editors on your pieces. So she's giving you some kudos. Before we dive more into that story and the process, let's take a step back for our international audience and maybe for people who are not as familiar with such an important part of our history, American history, journalism history. Briefly, what were the Pentagon Papers?
The Pentagon Papers were a secret history of American decision-making in Vietnam. They had been requested by the Department of Defense, or a study. The study had been initiated by the Department of Defense, by the Defense Secretary in about 1967. And it was put together by several people, a number of people, different parts of it, looking at decision-making going back through the entire American experience in Indochina. And one of the people who had worked on it as a consultant from the Rand Corporation, who had spent time in Vietnam and previously been an analyst for the Defense Department, was Daniel Ellsberg. The papers were important because they showed, when examined en masse, a history of consistent, by administration after administration, of consistent escalation of the war, expanding the number of troops, increased attacks on North Vietnam, and a failure to understand, a desire to, a clear history of having suppressed the administration's own doubts about the chances of success. So it was a serious indictment of a number of administrations, not least the Johnson administration, of their having, dare I say, misled, lied to the American public.
Absolutely, and that context is important. You were. As you were talking, David Beard, a colleague of ours, asked the question, so you did an interview in 2015 and had no idea whether the world would see it for maybe decades. What was that like to know that you had, you had other projects, you were working on other books, but this is, an incredible story that you're sitting on, and you couldn't share it with anyone.
That's exactly correct. I mean, I was able to share it with the Times, of course, so I was able to write it and get the reaction of my editors. But yes, I could never talk about it. I not infrequently the subject of the Pentagon Papers, Neil Sheehan, whatever would come up in my life, and I would have to just keep my silence. Then, as you know, Steven Spielberg made a film about the role of the Washington Post in the Pentagon Papers case, which my only thought at the time was, if you only knew, the far better story is the New York Times part of it. Maybe I should, as you said, you asked me to give the background of what the papers were. Would you like me to just briefly explain what happened from that moment, just so that people who are not familiar with that thing understand their significance in establishing a legal precedent in the United States?
Absolutely, please.
So, Daniel Ellsberg, who, as I said, had been in Vietnam and had worked for the Defense Department and then was back working on these on part of the Pentagon Papers, had by that point become passionately convinced that the war was a serious mistake and a waste of lives on both sides. And he had in the past been respectful of the kind of tradition or principle that documents shouldn't be leaked, but he, as he describes in his own 2002 memoir, he noticed when a particular story burst onto the scene in the late 60s that had based on a leak, and how it sort of created the possibility that it might prevent Johnson from, escalating again, because if leaking was going to happen, it might be a check on the government. He decided, along with another man at Rand named Anthony Russo, to copy the entire 7,000-page Pentagon Papers, this secret report, which was top secret, which he did, and carefully and bravely took it out of the Rand Corporation where it was, and set about trying to find a way to make it public, to create the kind of public pressure that would perhaps ultimately contribute to ending the war. He tried various things. He tried going to members of Congress, hoping that they would perhaps hold hearings, and that would offer him some protection because he had committed a crime. But when that turned out to be a dead end, he decided to try approaching a newspaper, which wasn't his first choice, as I say, but he thought possibly that the New York Times had the prestige to pull it off, and they would maybe be willing to do what he wanted, which was basically put the whole thing into the paper, because he wanted this in the public domain. And that led to, when the Times, apart from the story that Neil Sheehan told me, which we'll get to, but that led to the Times beginning to publish in June of 71. And on the third day, the government, the Nixon administration, went to court for the first time in American history, it said, to try to block further publication of these documents and these stories on grounds of national security. It had been assumed up until then that the First Amendment protected the right of books and newspapers to publish this kind of thing. This was the first time that the government had asked for this, and a temporary restraining order was granted. So the Times was stopped on day 3 from publishing this series, which was written by Sheehan and a number of other reporters, massive series. And then there was a process period. It was accelerated up to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, the Washington Post had gotten involved and started publishing it. It too was blocked. And then the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in a split decision that the Times and the other newspapers could go ahead and publish. And it's considered a really important milestone in the history of government press relations, particularly in wartime, and an establishing of the idea that prior restraint is unacceptable in most cases.
New York Times Company versus United States, one of those milestone landmark cases.
Yeah.
Our friend David Beard is asking about the prepared obits file. So just to summarize the question, the work with Overlooked to try and bring in women and people of color, do you know if that's being addressed in the advanced obits as well, in terms of what's prepared for people?
That you'd have to ask that of the obits editor, and I'm assuming it absolutely is, but I really don't know. I mean, as you know, the Times has gone back and tried to rectify some of its past blind spots in terms of who got obits, and I can't imagine that it's not that the awareness of that problem in the past hasn't shaped the way the paper thinks about the way the obits staff and editor think about who should get an advance obit. Of course, there are so many people who might be worthy of an advance obit, and who you wouldn't want their death to be sprung upon you as journalists, that it's always very difficult to keep up with the all the different people who need this attention in advance. I'm told, actually, that one of the reasons that this practice exists is that when Kennedy was shot, the Times did not have any kind of obit, and that the policy of doing advance obituaries kind of, I think, either began or was intensified after that.
And maybe if Amy is still watching, she might offer some insight in the comments in Facebook on
that would be great.
What's going on with advance obits. So in addition, you mentioned that you had this great interview in 2015 and then had to seal it away under lock and key. And then you were busy working on some projects and particularly some books that you wrote, right?
That's right.
There are two that I want to share with folks. So I'm going to bring them up on the screen here. The Beneficiary, make it bigger, and A Singular Woman, the untold story of Barack Obama's mother. I'm assuming, I believe it's The Singular Woman that you were working on earlier. Tell us about the right?
That was before I spoke to Neil Sheehan. It was The Beneficiary that I was working on at the time. Yeah.
Tell us about The Beneficiary. What is that about?
To try to summarize it, it's sort of a family memoir about an exploration of the life and death of my father, who was an enormously privileged person and quite successful, and seemed in many ways to live an absolutely charmed life. He was a descendant of Gilded Age plutocrats, and he grew up in the place which I spent the first 14 years of my life on, an 800-acre estate a half hour outside Philadelphia. Ultimately, he drank himself to death, having had quite a successful career. Ultimately, he was president and CEO of the Philadelphia Art Museum for 14 years and made serious contributions to civic life in Philadelphia, but died in a way that I found puzzling in light of all that had gone before. So I discovered in the wake of his death that there was a cache of family papers going back 100 to 150 years in this house that was sort of the center of this place. And I had finished the other book, and I thought I would go and check out those papers, and began to think, as any book writer or journalist would, well, there must be a book in here somewhere. And I decided that, one way to tell a piece of social history, both social and economic history, that spanned the whole century, was through the evolution of this family and the character of my father, the sort of how the groundwork had been laid, and then ultimately his death. And it becomes a kind of detective story, piece of social history, personal memoir, looking at the power and positive and negative of inheritance, sort of the ambiguous legacy of inheritance.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sounds fascinating. I want to acknowledge Amy actually answered the question for us. So appreciate that, Amy, that they're definitely trying to diversify obits, including ones written on the fly as well as advance. But she's also thinking about how to get a more diverse set of obit writers. We've been blessed to have both Amy and Neil Genslinger on the show. And Neil also wrote, there's a obit we didn't get to in today's paper of the director of the Up series, the documentary of that family that he went back to every 7 years, which is really interesting. So we'll make sure to share that as well. Any other thoughts you'd like to share with us about Neil, or that process of writing? Should we share the kicker in terms of for people to understand the relationship between Daniel Ellsberg?
I feel like that we're sort of talking around the central issue, which is why this story was such an eye-popping thing. As I say, Neil Sheehan had never really told what his end of it, and it was kind of assumed. The general sort of assumption was that Ellsberg bravely had given the Pentagon Papers to the Times. Well, it turns out that actually, as Neil pointed out, he didn't, quote, exactly give them to the Times. He approached Neil, and they worked out an agreement, which there may have been a misunderstanding there, but Neil assumed that Ellsberg was going to let him copy the papers, and when he went up to Cambridge to do that, Ellsberg said, no, you can just you can read them, but I'm not ready to give you a copy. And so Neil was very concerned about the possibility, at least as he described it, the possibility that someone would be tipped off, that Ellsberg had already approached people in Congress. He had talked about it. He'd made multiple copies, and was very concerned that something would happen so that the papers would be gotten by the FBI and locked up in a safe again. And he determined that that's not what he wanted. So to summarize, he, with the encouragement of his wife, who's also a Pulitzer Prize winning author, he went back and went up to Boston, and after Ellsberg had gone out of town for a few days, snuck the papers out in batches out of the apartment where they had been kept, and took them to various copy shops and copied every single one. Copy shop, Xerox machines broke down in the middle of the night, and they had to find another place. He had to get cash for the machines, which required working through various channels at the Times. Then he was taking the papers from the copy shops and putting them in suitcases that his wife had brought up from Washington, and then stashing the suitcases in lockers at the bus terminal in Boston, because he thought the bus terminal would be safer than the airport. And ultimately, the two of them flew all the papers back in suitcases. They bought an extra seat on a plane between the two of them, and strapped the papers in their suitcases and bags, because they didn't even dare put them in the baggage compartment.
They weren't going to check those.
No, they certainly weren't. So not only did he completely override Ellsberg's request that he not copy anything, but then he deceived Ellsberg over the next few months by telling him that the editors were uncertain. They were trying to figure things out. He'd been assigned to some other stories, but meanwhile, he and other editors and reporters were holed up in hotels, putting together this fantastic package that became the greatest scoop of a generation, and the result of the biggest leak of confidential documents in American history.
I think we can safely say he pulled an Ellsberg.
Yeah, the funny thing, well, you'll see, those of you who haven't read the story will see that in the end they run into each other, after this great, as Neil referred to it by quoting Ellsberg's wife, this monumental duplicity. They run into each other in New York, and he tells Ellsberg some of the story in brief, and Ellsberg says, so you stole it. You stole them just like I did, I think that's what he said. And Sheehan said, neither of us stole them. These papers belong to the American people.
There you go. And what a great, interesting story. That's my mom, so the Parekh, saying it was a great story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan Borstein, great show, great guests. Thank you. Therese Steiner, Joanne Flynn Black as well. Can't wait to read it. So exciting. So Joanne, definitely, I know that Paula shared the link earlier. It's a fascinating story. It's a great obit as well. Rachel Cooper mentions there's some additional information, I guess, and I'm assuming she's referring to Neil, that he also brought the Indian dance and theater to the fore. Is this, I'm assuming that it's not mentioned.
No, this is she's talking about another story, the Sunil Kothari's obituary.
Oh, I'm sorry. She was referring to that. That's
Yeah,
why
that
it
was a
looks like
fantastic. That was a really interesting obit. I absolutely agree.
And Chetna says, what a great story. And Carla says, it takes a great reporter like Janie Scott to get the information and tell it in such a great
Thank
way.
you, Paula.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Janie. Really appreciate it, and having that insight and having a little bit of the backstory behind this hidden gem.
Thank you, Neil, and thanks, Sri and Carla. I really enjoyed being here.
Great. So thank you very much. Again, another several good comments coming in. And Rachel confirming, yes, it was a different story. That's my mistake. I apologize for that. But again, we had a great show today. We had Janie Scott joining us to talk about Neil Sheehan and how he got the Pentagon Papers. And Rahadian is talking about your biography of President Obama's mother as well.
Thank
was
you.
Really,
Thank you.
really good. So Janet is thanking us, Ron Thomas. This show is an absolute must for continuous learning. Great job as usual. Ellen, Amron Austin, also terrific show today. Both women were so interesting. And Ellen, hopefully you saw my comment on Facebook earlier that we'll be talking about the 52 places next week. And so again, just to remind people, next week's guest is going to be Elizabeth Goodrich, the New York Times deputy travel editor. And it's not 52 places to go, it's actually 52 places we love. These are reader-submitted stories, which is really interesting. So we hope everyone will join us next week. And of course, we have She's on Call. Shri is going to be helping produce that show every week, 11 o'clock on Sundays. Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar and Dr. Marina Kurian are the hosts. And this week's guests are Dr. Mark Shapiro and Dr. Christine Whalen. So please make sure to tune in on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And as a reminder, our guest today was Julie Scelfo, journalist, author, and justice advocate, former New York Times staff writer, and author of The Women Who Made New York. Her motto, quit saying fake news, instead, get media savvy. And Neil Genslinger getting the last word. Any read-along that name checks 3 Neils is a great show. And I'll say not just 3 Neils, but 3 Neils who spell their name the right way, Neil. So thank you, Neil. Great way to end the show. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.